Aloha! This is me, MarkO, talking, and I welcome you to Dances with Dragons, a Green Heart Foundation podcast. In this podcast, you will hear about my real life stories and adventures, together with the exciting current projects of our Green Heart Foundation. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to listen. Welcome to our first episode. I want to take you back to the beginning, where I first had my fascination with traveling the world and collecting things. It all began sitting on my grandmother Rika's lap at her home on the St. Croix River, a small river outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I took particular interest in Grandma Rika's charm bracelet. She had this beautiful golden charm bracelet with dozen, at least, of different charms from different countries. So as she traveled, this was something that she started collecting, golden charms. There was the Eiffel Tower, there was a pagoda, there was a mariachi, and those became some of the fascinating places that I was intrigued. Grandma would share stories of the people she visited, the places, the food. And then one day she surprised me and she brought out this bag that had a bunch of coins in it. And then in another little satchel she loved her little bag. I would ask her about these different countries. And she even started to teach me a few words and expressions in foreign languages. Now I'm 3. And then this went on for the next couple years until at the age of 7, that's when I left Minnesota with my mom and a sister, and we moved out to Phoenix, Arizona. So I'm learning different words and realizing they don't speak English. And I remember Grandma would just always had certain expressions that she would love to say, fermez la bouche, whenever the kids were getting too loud and crazy or crying. And that simply means close your mouth. And I just love that people speak differently in different places. And they use different money, and they put a stamp from their country on their envelopes. So I was introduced to the world. And I started my first collecting. And I remember vividly, I had a hiding place in our first home that I was born into. In this old house, I found a little secret hiding place. Literally, it was behind, like there was some furniture, but there was this little cubby hole, but I could put things in there. And that's where I started hiding my coins and stamps. And I just was intrigued. And that really was my introduction to the world and traveling. We ended up moving to Arizona for 2 years. I was 8 and 9 years old. So I started travels, getting used to new people at school, new neighborhoods. And of course, I didn't like it. I didn't like having to go to a new school. Mom remarried after Phoenix, Arizona, where Mom met our soon-to-be new dad, Stevie Bartholomew. We left Phoenix, Arizona, and relocated to Fresno, California, where Mom somehow started getting a big tummy, and it turns out we had a second brother in the family, 2 boys, and little brother John was born in 1963. But that only lasted for a couple years, and then we moved to Los Angeles. And the first place was San Fernando Valley, is where I started my junior high and high school years, and never felt quite at home in this country. Because I just never felt welcome in a new school and a new neighborhood. So I was very much keeping to myself. I realized the importance of getting good grades, and this was also encouraged by Grandma Rika. She really impressed upon the grandkids how important an education was. And she said that when you can get into a university, that's when you really start your education. So I began getting fascinated with education and learning. And there were certain classes that really grabbed me, touched my heart. And I can say that adventure was something. I always loved hearing people that were talking, telling about a story. And so after living in San Fernando Valley for a few years, I wasn't even allowed to graduate high school in the Valley. I started my junior freshman year. And then all of a sudden, bam, they moved. And of all places, in 1967, 68, my parents decided enough living in a house. They bought a boat, and it wasn't a big boat, but it was 3 children and mom and dad. So there were 5 of us living on a 45-foot cabin cruiser, it was called, not a sailboat. I started high school at Westchester High School, right next to Los Angeles International Airport, and started living on a boat. I didn't realize how cool that was, but it certainly impressed the ladies. So, life on a boat, going to high school, and we began traveling. And it became so easy to literally drop the lines, which are the ropes affixed to the dock, and we would drop lines and take off to Catalina. So it turns out there was an island 27 miles away from California coast, Los Angeles area. So I was always around people traveling on a boat, people who had traveled around the world, and I'm always asking questions. Well, what's it like there in that country? Turns out I had an uncle, Stanford Shaw, and he was a professor. He was a professor at UCLA, and his specialty was Turkish studies. He knew things about Turkey. He spoke fluent Turkish. And here my grandma was speaking some French, and coming from California, you hear Spanish, of course, growing up, with Mexico a couple hours drive to the south of LA. But Stanford Shaw, Uncle Stanford, impressed upon me how important university is, the different professors that are going to be influencing, because he said, you don't just pick the class for the class. And I've always taught my children, it's not just about the class and the subject, it's the professor. And is the professor passionate about the subject? So Uncle Stanford convinced me that the best colleges in California were this private university called Pepperdine in Malibu and UC Irvine. He said this is the newest of the University California campuses. But UC Irvine was this small campus. Evidently, it had just opened a few years before. So Stanford inspired me to travel and get to a small university. I applied to both Pepperdine and UC Irvine and got accepted to both. I was quite the student back in the day in high school, and I picked UC Irvine. And that's where I was soon to go. What started happening when I was 18 and starting at university was Vietnam War in our face. It was something that was getting more and more intense. The war had been going on for years. They had been drafting these young boys from the US since 64, 65. By 1970, it was out of control. President Nixon had won the presidency and escalated America, US's involvement in Vietnam. This became part of every young person, especially the young boys, when you were in high school. Are you going to get drafted? Are they going to literally call you off to a war? I began hungering for these exotic subjects at university. My first year as a freshman at UCI, I was following my parents' lead. You're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. So I took the first year of pre-med, took all these horrific classes that I just felt, this bores me. This is nothing of interest to me, because I started taking a few social science classes. And these were the titles of my classes: Utopian Visionaries. And we studied the world of utopia. Another class was titled, Is There Any Hope? Another class, Rainbows and Things. And that actually was a class in physics and studying the nature of light, refracting rainbows and things. Then I got a couple of professors that turned my life around. And again, thanks to Uncle Stanford, he inspired me to look at what professors might be visiting a campus. And it turns out there were two professors that were only visiting for that particular couple quarters that year. I believe they were retained for one entire year. One professor was the name Lou Smith. Lou taught a class in what was called Introduction to Black Culture. And what I learned in that class changed my life. And I can simply say, to this day, out of all the people that had the greatest impact on me in my life, and there are many, many who became almost as important as Lou Smith, but this man touched me in my heart. I was inspired by Lou Smith, this African American, teaching me about Black culture and the books that we read, but it was about his eloquence in speaking. This man had a passion and had a way of delivering a message that was so fired up, he was angry. This was 1970, 71. A few years earlier, there were the Watts riots. It was a part of East Los Angeles. I was there. I was junior high school and high school in the Valley, and they started these riots. The African American community started rioting, and they burned the entire city down. And Lou was one of the founders of different organizations that he started to rebuild Watts. It was so broken, the government didn't care about anything as far as helping the people, giving them aid. Lou taught us that you just don't talk about it, you take action. He did a couple things. He started the type of action that people can take as far as walking their talk. He looked around at his culture, his society, and Lou simply said, why is it every Christmas all across the country and around the world, children who are of diversity, children particularly who are African American, the girls open up their dolls on Christmas morning, and it's a little white doll with blonde hair, and her name was Barbie, and she was the most popular doll of the time, and I believe still today. White Barbies. Lou saw a devastated city. People had no jobs. There was nothing to do. They burned all the different offices. They burned the shops. They pillaged all the shops. It was just a broken city. He went to the Mattel toy company, which I believe was right there in LA area, Southern California. He went to Mattel Toys and negotiated to get all their broken down, dilapidated doll machines, loaded them in trucks, brought them to a warehouse that he virtually rebuilt, and started having the mechanic-minded guys without jobs fixing the machines, and they put the first black doll on the market. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things that Lou taught me, to take action. If you want change, if you want to change our world, you must do it. You must take the step and take action. So that man influenced me. And I believe, just a side note, I was one of 3 white kids in a class of 40 students. What I learned being in that class, and I remember Fridays, since it was the end of the week, Lou would invite us down to Watts, down to his factory to sit and drink and smoke because they did a lot of drugs and drinking. So we would go down on Fridays, and it was like church. It was like religion. Every Friday, many students decided not to go, but this white boy decided I wanted to go. We learned what it was like to be discriminated against. We were the token whites. So any problem that the entire culture of African American Black society, anything that pointed the finger at the white man did this and the white man did that, and Christopher Columbus, what he did to the Native American Indians, and on and on and on through history, I became a minority. And it was the first time in my life at 17 years of age I realized what discrimination was against me. That changed me. It made me realize this isn't fair. This feels horrible. And Lou inspired me beyond. And I was reading incredible books, but I remember two books that impacted me in absolutely a profound way. Were two authors, two famous philosophers, I believe, from around the middle of the 19th century, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, teacher and student, disciple. The two books that I read that again impacted my life and inspired me to travel. Meetings with Remarkable Men was the title of one book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. And I want to meet remarkable people in my search, as well as one of the most profound best-selling authors of the day in the early 70s was Central American man. He was named Carlos Castaneda. In all of my travels, I have continued to meet people, the young travelers and some of the old backpackers. Carlos Castaneda wrote 22 books, possibly more. His books were about shamanism. I had no idea what a shaman was, but simply a shaman is a medicine man or a medicine woman, someone who has powers like what's called a witch doctor, but they're healers. They're spiritual healers. They connect with the divine. They connect with other worlds, the unseen worlds. And Castaneda's initial books, at the time, 71, 72, he had only completed two books. His first book, Meetings with Don Juan, and then he did a second book, Separate Reality. And the third professor that inspired me was a man named Professor George Kent. He had a class in Chinese philosophy. I was wanting to blow my mind. I was wanting to expand my mind, but this was a concept back in the 60s and 70s, to open your mind, tune in, turn on, and drop out to the reality. But George Kent was giving me an alternative to another way of thinking, Asian philosophy. Basically, he was saying, they call it Buddhism. This is the other religion, but it's really a way of life. And Professor George Kent taught me about pacifism, about nonviolence. We began studying Mahatma Gandhi, and they basically inspired me to get out of America, get away from a country that supported this war called Vietnam. By the way, I began a life only a couple years later, a few years later in Asia, and I was in Southeast Asia, and I went directly to the source countries of that war, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And most people don't realize it's not called the Vietnam War. Vietnam did not start that war. The war was called by all those people the American War in Southeast Asia. American War. And that just woke me up, and I realized, yeah, of course, it's not their war. America brought the war to Vietnam and then Laos and Cambodia. So this is where I began learning that the war was evil and that I wanted out of America. I wanted out of the culture that I grew up in, and I had had all the mentors that I could ever dream of, and I was ready for my travels. That's the most epic year in my life was 1972, when I was having all these professors beginning to realize I could get out of the Vietnam War and I could go to another country. And it was about a program at the University of Irvine. They offered an international study abroad program. I was able to get a scholarship and go to a university in Sweden. I had my choice of countries, but I had heard that a lot of the draft dodgers from Vietnam, the guys who went AWOL, that were in Vietnam and did not want to ever go back and fight that war, Sweden was one of the most neutral, receiving countries to accept these draft dodgers to come to their country. Thank you for listening to Dances with Dragons. I hope you all enjoyed my stories of the adventures of a modern-day MarkO Polo. Join us next week to listen to more exciting real-life stories. If you enjoyed our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with others. To learn more about us, please visit our website at greenheartfoundation.org and follow our social media accounts. See you next week.